Thanks for joining me in this segment of Belly Flopping into Mysticism. This is the start of my second series, which initially I called Better Metaphors. But after looking into the terminology associated to metaphor, I actually use analogies more than metaphors. So better analogies doesn't have quite the same ring to it, but so I haven't decided how I'll entitle it. But basically, I have a number of favorite quotes, and one is from Buckminster Fuller, who said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." Well, in this case, what I hope to do is present analogies and metaphors that are better than the dominant one that too many people are told when they go through a mental crisis or mental struggle. Um, but before I mention what that one is, I just want to talk a little bit about metaphors and analogies based on just some basic research that I've done. This kind of takes me back to junior high English classes, and I think when I learned some of this. Basically, a metaphor is saying that something is something else. One of the examples in an article I read is time is a thief. And so it creates a strong connection. And the goal of a metaphor, or kind of the purpose of a metaphor, according to this article, is to have a strong kind of emotional reaction or a strong feeling about that gets elicit from the statement. Whereas an analogy is comparing two different things. A metaphor compares different things like that, or equates them even. Whereas analogy compares two things that are seemingly different, not just for the emotional response, but actually for the logical connection and seeing similarities and being able to attach something that is more physical or concrete with maybe something that's more abstract. And that's really what I tend to do when I try and describe some of the experiences I've been through. Is it's not so much to promote the the emotional response as it is, hey, from a logical standpoint, even from a learning standpoint, these types of comparisons do a decent job of describing, say, the intensity of the experience or other elements of it. So the dominant metaphor or analogy that's been used in the mental health system for a few decades now is, and you may have heard it, is that these mental illnesses, which right there, the concept of an illness isn't quite right for my type of experience, but that mental illnesses, these are like diabetes, which basically is that, like diabetes, you treat it with insulin, there's a problem with the pancreas, and you need to take insulin mostly for the rest of your life, is what people are told. And of course, the comparison then is that these are mental illnesses, and you basically need to take drugs or medication for the rest of your life. And I don't know if I was told that specifically. The insinuation was definitely there back in 1998. And the whole time I'm like, no, that isn't what this is. That's, for me, a poor metaphor, a poor analogy. And what has happened is that some people are trained and actually believe this is what this is, that what happens in these mental areas are equivalent or are like diabetes, that is a strong comparison. And even in the medical field, you don't treat everything like diabetes, right? So you go in, you get evaluated, looking at symptoms, looking at behaviors, looking at issues, maybe even past history. But not everyone gets treated like diabetes. And that actually ties in with the illness as metaphor. Is that people actually believe these are illnesses in that way. Well, the problem is my experience is much more of a wound or an injury, which gets treated differently. I've long used the analogy of a fractured leg. What I experienced, and I've said this for 20 some years, is that my experience is no more an illness than a fractured leg. Now, a few years ago, I had read an article out of the UK where a woman said, no, my experience is not like a fractured leg. And then I took that and said, oh, gee, I can't use that analogy anymore. No, I can. She can't. She shouldn't. And that's where in this overall just pool of variability of these types of experiences, variability of the experiencers and everything else, there should be room for both. Okay. But to whittle it down, I like one of the Einstein quotes that said, make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. To try and put this down, all of this down to these are illnesses. Now, a lot of times they're actually responses, either to prolonged stress, toxic environments, past trauma that gets stored and then shifts over time. There's any number of different models that currently are too often overlooked because of the dominance of this diabetes. These are all like illnesses and diabetes. And actually even Robert Whitaker, who I interviewed a couple years ago and created the website Mad in America, which is a place for people to talk about, hey, these types of systems aren't always in the best interest of the people involved. He was talking to a psychiatrist, and I forget how long ago it was. I would guess it was probably in the early 2000s. And even the psychiatrist, I don't know, the concept of the diabetes metaphor or diabetes comparison came up, and the psychiatrist said that was just a metaphor. I think it was an analogy if you split hairs based on the difference between metaphor and analogy, but basically that was just a metaphor. That was just a way of comparing. And that's where this Buckminster Fuller quote of, to change things, you don't fight against the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And that's where a couple of years ago, I actually, I generated a list. I have like more than 40 different analogies that I could use to capture different parts of my type of experience. And that's what this series will be. We'll be talking about, sharing those. And thankfully, I was able to group a number of them together that talked about or that illustrated certain components of my type of experience. Now, what was interesting to me, and I think it was about a little over a year ago, I was talking to a friend and her husband, that it was interesting because even this diabetes analogy is decaying, is falling apart. Because basically her husband had gone to the doctor, and of course there were, different blood tests or whatever, and was showing signs of pre-diabetes. And the medical doctor told him and said, 20 years ago, I would have just started treating this chemically, meaning I would just prescribe insulin. That's what I was taught to do, and that's what you do in these situations. But he said, since then, I've learned that there are a number of other factors to consider for how to deal with this. That I need to understand, how do you process stress? What is your life like? What kind of, diet do you have? How do you, do you exercise regularly? Do you, what is your outlook on life? I don't know what the specific things were that this doctor said, but when she told me that, we hadn't been talking about, mental health comparisons, but I, of course, looked at it right away and thought, so even this diabetes analogy is not fully withstanding the test of time in terms of what are some of these other factors that could be affecting how the pancreas manages insulin and that type of thing. As I mentioned, the problem is even with illness, mine was much more of a physical wound or injury than it is an illness. That, at least that's how I associate to it. And, this is my life. I get to do that. But one of the analogies that I figured out early on that I've used for over 20 years, I'm trying to remember, I'm trying to remember if I included it in the book. But I use the analogy that if I were to set my feet up on a coffee table, I'm sitting on a couch and I have a coffee table and I put my feet up there, and every day I add a half pound of stress onto my knees. At some point, my knees are going to buckle. It has nothing to do with biochemistry. It has nothing to do with genetic predisposition. It has nothing to do with anything other than I am overstraining my knees. And I am basically abusing my knees to the point that they break. Now, when the knees collapse and break, is my biochemistry out of balance? Absolutely. I mean, I will be in significant pain. That whatever energy has been stored up will be in a process of trying to get my attention, whatever response happens. And that's the stress that had been building in my system over several years. And then along comes something that woke me up to how conditioned I had become in that environment. So that for me is a much better analogy than this whole diabetes thing. Another analogy I use, especially when I'm chatting with someone, because again, the general public doesn't necessarily know that the diabetes analogy is so commonly used. Although earlier this year, granted, I was talking to a young woman in her 20s who mentioned seeing a therapist and had never heard of that analogy. I was like, wow, how did you get so lucky? But another metaphor I use is that of a fish tank. So, if you have a big aquarium, you have a number of expensive fish in there and you take care of it, and you noticed one of your fish, or maybe a couple of your fish, is acting poorly, is acting sluggishly, or whatever. Sure, you might take the fish to the vet and see if there's something going on, biologically or whatever. But one of the first things you're probably going to do is check the water in the tank. That is, what is the environment that these fish are in? And, the physical body can only withstand so much before it starts to affect the body in some way. So for me, that's as good of an analogy. Then we can start talking about toxic work environments, toxic families, toxic whatever. And a lot of that toxicity isn't overtly noticeable. It's that you're there for a while. So back in, was it 2018 in the spring, it's like April, from a friend of a friend of a friend kind of situation. I get this message request saying, in 2017, I started sharing a bit more publicly about my past experiences. And this man reached out and said, gee, you've talked about your own breakdown and some of the struggles you faced. He said, I think I'm going through something similar. Could we chat? And I responded back and I said, well, if by chat you mean actually getting on a phone and talking a little bit, I'm game. If it means sitting there typing responses back and forth, I'm not interested. That just takes a little bit too much time. And so we coordinated time to get on the phone. And I said, well, what do you want to talk about? What's going on? And right away, he started talking about how, in his family, his dad had been an alcoholic and the effects that had on him growing up. And this was a guy, I think at the time he was in his late 40s or early 50s. And I'm like, okay, so there's some stuff there. But I said, in your message, you made it sound like this is fairly recent that you've been having something that you're concerned about. So what's going on? And that's when he said that he'd been on a medical leave. I'm not sure if it was like for, some kind of surgery or some kind of accident. They had rehabilitation time. I didn't know. I was under the impression that it was for probably a couple of months, give or take a couple of weeks. And basically he was ready to go back to work. And I thought, well, that's interesting because, of course, for me, some of my work environments contributed to the breakdown I endured. And I just asked him, I said, well, so do you like what you do? And he said, well, yeah. And I said, so what's your work environment like? Do you like it? He said, it's the strangest thing. I love the people I work with. I think they're great. And yet the work environment itself, it's like you can't do enough to satisfy the managers. They're always coming along. Oh, we need you to do this too. We need you. And I can't remember who brought it up, but it was very subtle. Like if someone were to walk into this office it would look all neat and clean, and everybody has their workstation and whatever. But for someone who is in it or was in it and then is faced with going back to it, I said, I think your nervous system is putting the brakes on. At that time, I had not yet learned of polyvagal theory, which ties in with nervous system health, the fight, flight, freeze, co-regulation, stuff like that. But I said, I think your nervous system's going, whoa, don't send me back to that. And of course, then it's a different problem, because can he find a job in another area that pays the same and whatever? But I said, that's something. I said, I couldn't remember if he had been seeing someone, a counselor or anything like that. But I said, you might want to look at that something about your system is saying, hey, this isn't healthy. And what was interesting to me was about 5-6 months later, and he lived in a different time zone, more than 1,000 miles away. About 6 months later, I was walking across a parking lot, ran into a woman that I hadn't seen. I used to coach her back when I was in college and she was a teenager. And we get to chatting. And as it turns out, she had just been laid off working for the same, national company, same division in the company. And she told me how so many people in her group, had ended up depressed and what an environment it was. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? Same company, same department in the company, more than 1,000 miles apart. And this woman actually left of her own volition and found a job. It actually paid less, had fewer hours, and was much happier for it. But at the same time, how often will that work across the board? For 100 people dissatisfied, can you go find another job that you like? That's not always that easy to do. At least that's not my take. So anyway, to me, that fish tank, look at, hey, what's the environment? What is the person's day-to-day experience? Rather than just jumping on and, oh, this is an illness. And I do mention this, I think I do, I don't know. But what are the social disorders? We call everything disorders, which I have other issues about. You can tell I'm opinionated. But we want to say these people have all these disorders. Well, how does that relate to social disorders? Whether it's something like poverty, or something like being around a greedy person all the time, or overly manipulated in our society, or whatever. Where's the talk of social disorders and how that affects people? And to me, it's those social disorders that is related to environment, right? So anyway, like I say, I have a number of different ones that I'll be sharing in this series. One thing that I made a note of is that a lot of times when it comes to the types of experiences I had, which ended up in states that could be called psychosis and all of that, is earlier this year I've been reading a few books, and different authors have used the term ineffable, that these types of experiences are ineffable. I think it was John Weir Perry, a book out of the 1970s that I read, The Far Side of Madness. He used that term. Another one that compares Jung's psychology to Tibetan Buddhism. The author also used that term. A couple other places. And generally, ineffable means that you can't adequately describe it. There's no real words to capture it. An example I use is try defining the word blue without using a noun, right? So, you can't point to the sky, you can't point to that t-shirt or whatever, and now try and describe, so that goes to some of the fallibility of language that we face, especially when dealing with abstract concepts. Metaphors and analogies, because they take these more concrete examples, do allow often a connection to that abstract. And it's often that abstract part that is ineffable. And that's why I even mentioned in the last series the bit about abstract concepts, the psyche and the mind, the id, the shadow, those are all abstract concepts. The ego, all of that. And so by taking analogies that people are familiar with from the physical world and comparing that to some of the things that can happen, that can be a valuable tool. Another note I made is that basically it's the person who's experiencing all this is the one who can best identify. They might not be able to come up with the metaphors on their own, but they can find resonance with different metaphors. Over time, they can, I think it becomes a little bit easier to go, how do you describe this? And I remember that from being in Banff. It's like, wow, how do you describe this? This is so beyond the pale. But that's where other more helpful metaphors and analogies can be beneficial in helping not just that person come up with something that is ineffable, but it also then becomes a way for that person to interact with others and have some way of describing something of use that can then become more helpful. So yeah, that's what my goal is to throw some better, at least for me, better metaphors and analogies that either did help later on in the healing process, but they most certainly would have helped early on. Rather than being told, oh, this is what this is. No, other people who've been through this describe it in several different ways. Do any of these resonate with you? Let's use that as a starting point. That's an entirely different way of approach than what I experienced. So, yeah, this is the start of series 2. I have several segments planned out, and thanks for joining me. I hope you find some use to this. And I always forget to mention that this is not intended to be medical advice or anything like that. This is really discussion, sharing what helped me, sharing what didn't. Yeah, and if you like what I'm doing, share, encourage others to watch a video or whatever, because we need better models in this system. That'll probably end up being a whole other series. So anyway, thanks for joining me. I hope you have a great day, and we'll see how this series turns out.